All right, let's dive in. The economy and the law, they can feel like they're in two totally different worlds, right? But what happens when they collide? Well, today we're going to look at a fascinating moment back in early 2026 when some really mixed economic signals were suddenly overshadowed by a huge Supreme Court decision, a decision that put a check on presidential power and sent some serious ripples through the entire market. Let's break it down. Okay, so to set the scene, picture this. It's early 2026, and the U.S. economy is sending some seriously mixed signals. It was just plain confusing. On the one hand, we had some genuinely good news. U.S. manufacturing was finally expanding after a full year of shrinking. But on the other hand, the jobs market, a huge pillar of the economy, seemed to be hitting a brick wall. So you had these two crucial indicators pointing in completely opposite directions.
So first up, the good news. The manufacturing PMI report for January came in at 52.6. Now, if you don't track this stuff obsessively, all you really need to know is that any number over 50 means the manufacturing sector is growing. And this was a big deal because it was the first time it had been in growth territory in 12 long months. New orders were up, production was increasing, things were definitely looking up.
But then, this number dropped. The ADP report showed that only 22,000 private sector jobs were added in January. I mean, that is a shockingly low number, a really dramatic slowdown. So you've got factories humming along, but companies are barely hiring. What gives? That was the central puzzle that had economists and investors all scratching their heads.
And right in the middle of all this economic confusion, a legal bombshell that had been years in the making was finally about to go off. Suddenly, the focus wasn't just on economic data anymore, but on this fundamental challenge to presidential power that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
So mark your calendars. February 20th, 2026. The Supreme Court hands down a massive decision in a case called Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump. And trust me, this wasn't just some technical legal ruling. This thing was about to fundamentally alter the landscape of American trade policy and send shockwaves through the whole economy.
So what was this all about? Well, at its heart, the case boiled down to one simple but absolutely profound question. Can a president, on their own, use a national emergency to impose massive taxes, because let's be real, that's what tariffs are, on goods coming into the country? Or is that a power that belongs somewhere else entirely? This was the constitutional showdown the court had to settle.
And settle it they did. In a really decisive 6-3 ruling, the court drew a firm line in the sand, basically reasserting a core principle of the Constitution. So let's break down exactly how they got there.
Okay, so the whole fight really came down to this one law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or as it's known, IEEPA. This law was passed way back in 1977 to give the president some flexibility to respond to foreign threats by, regulating economic activity. The Trump administration had been arguing that this law gave it the authority to impose those sweeping tariffs, all under the umbrella of a national emergency.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court majority, they weren't buying it. And this quote from their opinion, it gets right to the core of everything. They said point blank that tariffs are a form of tax. And the power to tax, they reminded everyone, is given exclusively to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. See, this wasn't just a squabble over trade policy. This was about something much bigger. Who gets to tax the American people?
The court's logic was actually pretty straightforward. You can really break it down into 4 simple steps. Step 1, the Constitution is crystal clear. Congress and only Congress has the power to tax. Step 2, tariffs are a tax on imported goods. That's just what they are. Step 3, while that IEEPA law allows a president to regulate imports, it never explicitly says they can tax them. And for the court, that was the key. You can't just take the word regulate and stretch it to mean tax. They're two totally different powers. And therefore, using IEEPA for tariffs was an unconstitutional overreach into Congress's territory. Simple as that.
So, a really clear legal ruling, right? Well, yes and no. Because back in the real world, the fallout was, it was messy. And it was immediate. The decision instantly created a whole new set of political and business challenges that had to be dealt with, and fast.
And when I say fast, I mean incredibly fast. The White House response was almost instantaneous. So on the morning of February 20th, the Supreme Court says, nope, those tariffs imposed under IEEPA are invalid. But by that afternoon, just hours later, President Trump announced he was imposing new 10% global tariffs, this time using a totally different law, the Trade Act of 1974. The administration didn't miss a beat looking for a new legal justification.
But wait a minute.
The ruling created this huge multi-billion-dollar question that nobody had an answer to. For years, American importers had paid billions and billions of dollars in these tariffs. Tariffs, the court just said, were collected unlawfully. So what about all that money? Do those businesses get it back?
And this is where things got really complicated, creating a ton of uncertainty for businesses. I mean, sure, it seemed like importers were entitled to get that money back, but the Supreme Court didn't lay out a process for it. They didn't say how or when. They basically kicked that can down the road, leaving the whole massive, complex job to the lower courts and to Customs and Border Protection. So for thousands of American companies, it was this weird situation. You won the legal battle, but good luck actually seeing that money anytime soon.
Okay, so let's pull all this back to where we started, the economy, and more specifically, Wall Street. How did the market digest this constitutional earthquake happening at the exact same time as all those other mixed economic signals?
And this is what's so fascinating. If you just looked at individual companies, everything looked fantastic. You had big tech companies like Intuit and Zscaler just crushing their quarterly results, beating expectations for both earnings and revenue. I mean, on paper, these are the kind of numbers that should have Wall Street popping the champagne, right?
But they weren't. All that great news from individual companies, what you might call the bottom-up picture, it just couldn't compete with the massive top-down uncertainty that was shaking the whole system. The market as a whole was nervous, and the Supreme Court's decision was a huge reason why.
This is when you started hearing analysts use a specific phrase, a late cycle transition. It's basically a fancy term for when the pros on Wall Street start getting nervous. They see big, high-level policy shifts and economic instability, and even if corporate profits look great today, they start getting really worried about tomorrow. They saw this legal fight not just as a headline, but as a source of fundamental, system-wide risk.
And look, you don't have to take my word for it. Check out this quote from a big market intelligence report that came out right after. It says it all. The dominant story of the day, the thing driving how investors behaved, was this fundamental restructuring of trade policy. Basically, the court case was a bigger deal than earnings reports, a bigger deal than inflation data. Why? Because it felt like the fundamental rules of the game were being rewritten right before their eyes.
And all this really leaves us with one big question to chew on. This entire episode is a perfect snapshot of that classic tension in the market. So in a complex economy, what really moves the needle? Is it the hard numbers, the profits a company puts on a balance sheet? Or is it the bigger, messier stuff, those fundamental shifts in politics and government power? It's a great question and definitely something to think about.